Good day folks and welcome to the Anorak Review Show with I host, the Anorak. And this is week 4 of Anoraknoween. And as with last week, I'm taking a look at another double album. This time though, not by Elton John, as with the last 2 weeks, but instead by one of my favourite prog bands, Genesis. Across the past few months of this year, I've taken a look at some of their albums, particularly 1976's A Trick of the Tail, 1981's Abacab, and 1986's Invisible Touch. 3 different albums released 5 years apart that kind of show the gradual evolution from pure progressive rock to a more prog pop rock kind of sound that they would eventually adapt throughout the 80s and into the 90s. Which is the time we'll look at with this album. After the success of Invisible Touch in 1986, the band Genesis, all 3 members of them, Mike Rutherford, Tony Banks, and Phil Collins, decided to take a little break from their little union to focus more on solo works, such as Mike and Mechanics, and of course Phil Collins' own 1989 solo album, But Seriously. And then, when the 90s soon dawned, I decided to come back together to do yet another album, kind of carrying on the techniques and methods that they thought worked really well with the previous albums, such as the Mama album and Invisible Touch. Namely, coming up with songs in the form of improvisations. Mike and Tony would come up with chords on the bass and keyboards, while Phil would come up with drum patterns and occasional dummy lyrics that would sometimes occasionally even end up being the final lyrics of the songs. This time, though, they decided to go on a slightly bigger scale. This time, they would release a double album, over 70 minutes worth of content. The only other previous time Genesis ever done a double album was 1974's The Lamb Lies Down on Broadway, and that was when they had Peter Gabriel and Steve Hackett with them. And to help with them, they hired Nick Davis with the producing. Nick Davis has been known as a good sound engineer and producer and mixer, working on the Marillion album Season's End, and eventually the next Genesis album Calling All Stations, and even helped with various solo albums by Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford. I might look into some of those sometime soon, but for now though, let's take a look at Genesis' 1991 album, We Can't Dance. And going off the cover here, it seems pretty nice and nifty. It has the big boldness of Genesis logo in all lower caps, and one of the E's kind of mirrored off for some reason. And of course, this beautifully done watercolor painting of what is presumably a father and son looking up at the horizon. No doubt kind of a reference to the kind of father-son relationship of the first song, which we should go into soon. And the artwork in question was done by a company called Icon. I couldn't exactly find too much information about them, but I gotta say, whoever done these paintings, I gotta give props to. It does carry on the kind of minimalism that a lot of the Genesis albums up to this point have kind of carried with, namely Duke, Abacab, and the Mama album. And despite this being a double album, this copy I've got isn't a gatefold. So in order to get the actual LPs out, you have to pull them out. But still though, accompanying each of the lyrics of each song is another decently done little water painting, kind of giving a visual representation of each song and the kind of thematic elements. So kudos to the sense of minimalism in that department. So let's take a look at Genesis' We Can't Dance and see if it still holds up after like 30 years or so. Beginning side 1 and the album itself is No Son of Mine. The first single of the album, this begins with a rhythmic knocking sound, kind of like the ticking of a clock. Then it gets soon followed by a very distinct sound, which was actually made with Tony recording Mike's guitar with a sampler, then kind of playing back the sound kind of 3 notes down, which lowered the pitch rather significantly and created this trumpeting elephant-like sound effect. And they named this Elephantus, which it's a good thing his sound didn't make any sheep-like sound like or anything. Otherwise, they would have called this Sheepus. Anyway, as for the lyrics themselves, they're somewhat vague, but still kind of self-explanatory. It's about an implied abusive family relationship from the point of view of the son, who decides to run away from home to get away from all that abuse, only to return later to confront his parents, as we face the lyric of "You're no son, you're no son of mine. When you walked out, you left us behind." And I can definitely say, to anyone who has ever suffered any kind of abuse from family members, I'd say you could relate to a song like this. Be it husbands, fathers, sons, wives, daughters, mothers. I think anyone can relate to a song like this. It's vague, but it's also very ambiguous on how whether or not it's the son itself, the mother, or both of them are the victims of abuse. And honestly, even the father kind of gets a bit of sympathy, if I would say. Not to condone any kind of abuse, but one could say that when he says, "When you walked out, you left us behind," he could be referring to how the father has his own reasons, he has his own troubles that made him this kind of downfall. And honestly, it doesn't really have this kind of conclusive note. It kind of ends ambiguously. You never exactly know what truly happens when the son does return home. I do like that sense of ambiguity. It shows how sometimes the things that we afraid may happen may not always happen exactly the way we may think, whether it be for the better or for the worse. And considering that Phil would go on to do the songs for Disney's Tarzan about 8 years later, this could be about Karchak, the ape father, and his relationship with the human boy Tarzan, seeing him as not his son. "You're no son of mine because you're not an ape, you're a human." I don't know. Could be coincidence, but I think that could be pretty fun to think about. Next was the fourth single, "Jesus He Knows Me." A much lighter song compared to the previous. This one has more satirical lyrics, on par with previous Genesis songs like "Illegal Alien" and "Land of Confusion." This time, though, it takes the mickey out of American televangelists, especially those who use their faith and religions to exploit and scam people of their money so they can carry on with their own lavish lifestyles. It's the return of the guaranteed eternal sanctuary man. But anyways, this was back when such evangelists were a major thing at the time, so this song is pretty much a product of its time, but it's still a fun one nonetheless. A modern version of this would be like, say, like a pop-up ad or a spam message that kind of goes on spouting about God, religions, and sins and virtues and eternity and all that stuff. And much like Land of Confusion, this too has a very cute and funny video that go along with it, featuring the band members kind of playing evangelists, and with Phil himself doing a very kind of well done American accent and being the very humorous man that he is, telling people to touch the screen, touch the screen. If you actually watch the video for yourself, especially the uncensored version, you might be in for a chuckle. Although, I will say, this is not something to disparage or kind of slam all Christians or anyone of any religions in general. This is just kind of like a his take on a certain type of Christians. Even if you are a very religious person or not, I think you still enjoy a pop tune like this very fine. And side 1 ends with the 10-minute epic Driving the Last Spike. If this doesn't convince people that Genesis didn't completely abandon their prog roots, I honestly don't know what will. This piece kind of deals with the hardships and sufferings that many Irish immigrants or navvies have dealt with back in the 19th century, when they've had to build the many railways in the UK, and just the poor and harsh conditions they suffered through, and the inevitable deaths in it. And as you can imagine, they don't exactly sugarcoat it. They really give us an idea of how harsh this kind of environment was back then, but also kind of building a sense of hope and triumphance as soon as all the effort, all the hard work has finally been paid off when they, well, drive the last spike. Meaning that they finally hammered in that last nail to complete the whole railway. And honestly, the driving the last spike itself does sound like a very good meaning. A monumental moment where long, never-ending hardships finally get done and dusted. The lyrics in question here were mainly, if not entirely, written by Phil Collins, who was apparently inspired by it when he was given a book about such from an actor who wished to make a TV series or documentary about it. And that actor happens to be named Dennis Waterman. Uh, no, not that Dennis Waterman from Little Britain. The real Dennis Waterman. Yeah, yeah, that one. Anyways, yeah. This kind of carries on the semi-prog roots of Genesis, not entirely capturing the old vintage styles, but still kind of experimenting with long sections, both vocal and instrumental. There are a lot of lyrics written across here, kind of telling the story from an individual's point of view, just seeing all that's going on around him, kind of this almost stream of consciousness, seeing how believing that things may be safe but they may not be so, and like I said, implying that some people have passed out and died, but still praying that someday that they'll reach their goal and get this done, and almost thinking about the families back home, how they're feeling, how they're praying for them, for their safety, for their safe return. And you feel that not only in Phil Collins' vocals, but also in the synths and guitars of Tony Banks and Mike Rutherford. It's it's honestly one of the few songs here that actually are based on historical events. And honestly, it may not entirely be accurate, but it still gives a very good picture of what might have happened back then. And it is also a good way to close out the first side of the album before we go into the rest of the album onwards.